popularity of the CW's The Vampire Diaries, while arguably a symptom of the Twilight craze that drove most of the media and popular YA fiction in the early 2000s, is also a microcosm for the modern rise of morally ambiguous villains. While it is impossible to deny the influence of characters like Draco Malfoy and Kylo Ren on popular perceptions of morally ambiguous antagonists, more often than not shipped with a main female lead, nothing can hold a candle to the Vampire Diaries' pure plethora of morally ambiguous characters, simply because there are practically no non-morally ambiguous characters to behold. While in essence based on a popular book series of the same name published in the early 90s, the CW's The Vampire Diaries created almost entirely its own set of conflicts, and largely altered the personalities, relationships, and backstories of most of its main characters, to the point in which very little more than names and some incidental elements remain. One of these major changes came in the form of one Damon Salvatore, the poster child for morally ambiguous men in the modern fantasy genre. The blueprint of the now hyper-prevalent dark-haired, brooding, and often obsessive love interest, modeled somewhere between interpretations of Hades and a Byronic hero, Damon acts as a largely antagonistic force early in the show, before turning into the dark-haired half of a love triangle that often found itself in the same poles as Bella, Edward, and Jacob, and Katniss, Peeta, and Gale. Damon's quick turn from definitive villain who hurts women and drains people of their blood for fun to seeming anti-hero who makes quips about murder and gets memed for being the only rational one dealing with future villains is the first of many examples of a villain becoming morally gray within the show. The most infamous of these examples, however, is Klaus Michelson, a villain who famously was so well liked and so well acted that the showrunner chose not to kill him off as intended at the end of the show's third season. This change not only foreshadowed what would later become a progressive problem with the moral ideology the show seemed steadfast on exploring, but also opened the door for Klaus Michelson, indisputable villain, to become a morally gray figure in the show's fourth season. This also led, due to his overwhelming popularity, to Klaus getting his own spin-off that ran for 5 seasons and resulted in its own spin-off, prolonging the Vampire Diaries universe more than 5 years longer than the original show's cancellation. It is impossible to deny that this method of turning a villain into morally gray man surrounded by adoring or stubbornly indignant women is a popular way of exploring morality and evil within fantasy literature, especially with the modern rise of the dark, brooding, and villainous romantasy love interest. However, it is also impossible to state, as many have in recent years, that morally ambiguous characters, often men, have only transcended the traditional field of good and evil in the last 30 or so years. Yet even more prevalent is the idea that moral ambiguity in itself has only become mainstream in fantasy literature in this same period. Evil has been examined and explored in fantasy literature for centuries, and by examining this history of moral exploration, we can see how we went from the simple tales of good versus evil portrayed in classic fantasy epics like Beowulf and Arthurian legend, to the exploration of moral ambiguity found in modern fantasy novels like Game of Thrones and Six of Crows. If it wasn't already clear, today's video is complicated, to say the least. While it would take me months and a lot more research to fully analyze the history of evil and morality in fantasy literature and speculative fiction, today's video is an introduction to the topic that I plan to one day write a thesis on if possible. Until that point, or I have the time to outline a very, very lengthy video essay on the topic, we'll stick with a fun overview of historically impactful literature that brings us to modern examples, with as few references to fan fiction as physically possible, which will be hard later on. You're welcome. But for those of you who are new here, hi, my name is Rowan. I'm an aspiring fantasy author, overworked high school senior, and fan of fantasy literature. Here on my channel, we discuss writing, reading, history, and all of the ways those things intersect. So if any of that interests you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. I have a lot of fun ideas coming, including many an unhinged analysis I hope to be able to put out for you all. That said, back to the topic at hand. First, to establish a baseline, what exactly is evil? According to Merriam-Webster, evil is morally reprehensible and/or arising from actual or imputed bad character or conduct. However, within the realm of fantasy literature, specifically older fantasy literature, evil is usually defined by dark deeds, demonic imagery, and actively working against the societally held beliefs and values at the time. As we will touch on briefly later, lest I get distracted and go down a rabbit hole about witch trials, evil is in the eye of the perceived good, or often the majority, group within a given culture or society. All the way back in the days of Greek and Egyptian mythology, people discuss the complexity of morality within epics and other great tales. These myths are often cited as the originators for the modern fantasy genre. Humans are complex, with differing opinions, so how could they all agree on one societally accepted definition of evil? The concept of evil has always been explored through literature. From Oscar Wilde to J.R.R. Tolkien, authors of all eras and backgrounds have explored the idea of evil and its moral complexity within their stories. While the concept of evil was once viewed as a strict binary, it is now seen as more of a spectrum, as with most elements of morality and philosophy as a whole. Now viewed as a philosophical debate, the previous idea of evil as a strictly defined binary, once used to demonize potentially dangerous members of society, has since evolved, and the modern view of evil is far more nuanced. Evil is both a subjective concept and a complex idea. In order to properly understand the difference between ancient and modern portrayals of evil, it is important to first examine the complex nature of describing evil. Sociologists look at evil from a society-centered perspective and define it differently than psychologists who view it from a clinical perspective, or philosophers who debate the morality of any given action. Even writers can't decide on a concrete definition, as we've already mentioned. Some, like C.S. Lewis, depict it as primordial and incorporate Christian allegory. Others, like Anne Rice, play with the morality of doing evil deeds for good or even selfish reasons. No definition for or opinion on evil is inherently correct. As with most complex concepts, each holds a different piece of the puzzle within history and literature. It is important to never forget that when analyzing literature, while some authors view evil as a binary due to their time period or religious beliefs, others view it as a malleable idea perfect for creating interesting narratives. Without accepting the complexity of evil, it is impossible to analyze the portrayal of evil in literature across the centuries, and even more impossible to comprehend how we've reached a point in fantasy literature where the term evil is no longer a definitive negative. Throughout history, literature and religion have influenced societal interpretations of morality, or lack thereof, of many different actions and peoples, even at the time when most were illiterate. The history of the epic, often depicting simplistic tales of good versus evil, is almost always found in oral traditions of storytelling. Centuries before the printing press, when only the richest or most religious knew how to read, oral storytelling provided people with a way to experience grandiose tales of heroes defeating monsters. It is impossible to analyze the role of evil within literature without accepting the often demonizing role the concept played in some of history's greatest atrocities. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain, for example, called the Jewish and Muslim people they expelled and tortured during the Spanish Inquisition evil for following a different faith. Before, during, and after people were burned as heretics for different religious beliefs, evil was used to demonize women and men as well, who seemingly went against the will of the Christian God and the societal norms of the given era. The moral panic against witches during the highly superstitious Middle Ages was centered around the perceived idea of evil women, who gained power from either themselves or dangerous pagan gods, often demonized as the witches themselves. These examples led to the question of personal choice versus predetermined evil, which is prominent throughout the literature of this day. Do people choose to be evil, or are they born that way? This concept continues to be a thread in modern fantasy literature, shown through the prevalence of stories with corruption arcs, or fallen heroes. Are the people born evil, or do they choose to become evil? George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones brings this question up quite frequently. Very few characters are born evil. However, there's an argument to be made that Joffrey Lannister has always been a cruel, twisted, and horrendous person. In contrast, a character like Tyrion Lannister, his uncle, was not necessarily born evil, but the way his character seems to be leaning, his circumstances and traumas have brought him to evil. A specifically interesting case study in this contrasting view of predetermined evil versus chosen evil is two of the most popular epics of the Middle Ages, Beowulf and Arthurian legend. While Arthurian legend and the High Middle Ages would truly cement lasting stereotypes around evil within literature and society, Beowulf and other literature of its era began to lay the groundwork. Beowulf centers on the great hero Beowulf and his fight with the monstrous beast Grendel and his equally monstrous mother. Both Grendel and his mother are depicted as evil beings, descended from darkness and born only to be monsters that terrorize the innocent and morally accepted people of Scandinavia. Unlike the morally messy reality of conflicts surrounding evil at the time, Beowulf clearly depicts it as a clear black and white issue to the average reader. However, there is also a small amount of moral ambiguity within the story, such as how Beowulf is clearly not a morally pure character who defeats monsters only for the good of the people they terrorize. In truth, he fights monsters for riches and glory. This contrasts the modern version of an epic hero, superheroes, who often depict that pure moral goodness. For instance, Superman, who in many of his iterations is seemingly just doing it to be good. However, as with later iterations of Superman and most comic characters who began as saving people and defeating monsters and aliens simply to protect and defend the righteous people of the world, they would later find themselves in quite a few morally ambiguous storylines. Because from the days of Beowulf to the modern era, morality has never been black and white, even if, on the surface, mainstream viewpoints always see it as such. In contrast, Arthurian legend, written to further the romantic ideals of chivalry and courtly love, explores evil, while still in a clear binary, more complexly and openly than Beowulf. While evil is clearly depicted, morality as a whole, specifically the actions of characters like Arthur, Merlin, and Lancelot, is questioned. Many of the actions these characters take contradict not only the historical reality, but even the ideals of both courtly love and the code of chivalry many herald Arthurian legend as holding up. And while many modern adaptations of Arthurian legend, like T.H. White's The Once and Future King, are remembered for their romanticism more than their exploration of morality in a fantasy setting, BBC's Merlin takes the flaws of the original Arthurian legend characters and plots and pushes them further than ever before. Specifically, with the character of Morgana Pendragon. Originally a clear villain within Arthurian legends itself, she spends the first 2 seasons of Merlin as a largely sympathetic character. Morgana fights for the oppressed, those with magic, she's loyal to her brother and her friends, and cares about what's happening to the common people, even as her privileged position as a noble lady. She acts as any good noble lady should have in Arthurian legend. She is sympathetic, she's kind, she's likable. So when Morgana turns from haunted by visions and traumatized over paternal revelations to pure evil, I want to kill my brother, I was terrified would die not a season ago, in about 4 episodes, the explanation is largely chalked up to the inevitability of evil. Yet, at the same time, the narrative continues to portray Morgana as a complex character throughout Season 3 as she struggles with the influences of evil and darkness on her goal. Morgana is the perfect example of a character who was not inherently predetermined to be evil, but was driven to evil by the actions of those around her due to, if you guessed it, an obligatory prophecy. Fantasy is a really big fan of those. I'm not sure why. I'm not complaining. I love a good prophecy, but yeah. Back to the point. Turning back the clock, when exploring the idea of evil in the collective culture of Middle Ages Europe, we must turn to the all-consuming force of medieval Europe, Christianity. Christianity, especially the denominations highly prevalent during the Middle Ages, specifically Catholicism, is centered on the idea of good and evil. Many churches across Europe helped instigate the spread of stories depicting evil in a particular way. Specifically, the Catholic Church often associated evil with demonic beasts. Monsters and myths like vampires, werewolves, and dragons were all associated with evil and used to spread fear and deepen people's loyalties to the church. These demonic creatures, like many early depictions of evil, would later be repurposed, as we've already mentioned, turn from antagonists to morally ambiguous in modern literature. Examples of this are books in the paranormal fantasy genre, works by authors like Anne Rice and Cassandra Clare, and and ACOTAR. But that's its own video. Back to the topic at hand. The Catholic Church and its flourishing monasteries with their highly educated monks was one of the only sources of books in Europe during the Middle Ages, pre the invention of the printing press. This allowed these works of literature depicting a simplistic view of evil to remain recorded and impactful for centuries. It is this interconnection between the literary depiction and the societal expectation that truly connects the early, typically simplistic view of evil to the modern interpretation of the idea within fantasy literature as a whole. We have now reached the part of this video that I think is the most abridged you're gonna get. So, yeah. The amount of Enlightenment philosophy I could have gone into for this, you all are so lucky I didn't. So, instead, we enter the era of biblically influenced European literature, specifically British literature. Strap in. European literature has always been influenced by Christianity. But between the time of Beowulf and the 17th century Enlightenment, it was almost impossible to find any other basis for philosophical ideas within literature than that of Christian morals. Now that the Catholic Church has entered the fold in earnest, it is time to discuss the philosophical debate of evil through Lucifer, Eve, and the many witch trials of Europe. Depictions of these are strongly connected to historical depictions of evil. While including Lilith in this discussion would be fascinating considering the differences in her Christian and Jewish depictions, Eve is far more important in the development of the historical mainstream interpretation of evil as a whole, And since this is already a long enough video and this is already an abridged version, we're going to keep abridging it. Now, on the topic of Christianity, it is time we address the original fan fiction in the room, if you will. Dante's Inferno and John Milton's Paradise Lost. Oh boy. These novels discussed biblical stories in new contexts and helped solidify the cultural interpretation of evil. Paradise Lost, in particular, introduces a great deal of nuance into the discussion of both Lucifer's portrayal as pure evil and Eve's depiction as a corrupting influence. Both Lucifer and Eve continue to be explored by writers to this day, each new interpretation adapting to the shifting cultural views of morality and philosophy. However, while Milton certainly introduced more character depth into both Eve and Lucifer, the popularity of pious religion when he published Paradise Lost led to a deadly development in the idea of evil, the witch trials. Built on the back of religious extremism, economic subjugation, and fear of the unknown, the witch trials saw women, and it is important to note some men, across Europe killed under false accusations of witchcraft. No unjust persecution in European history is so linked to the influences of literature, or as prominent in modern minds, as the witch trials. As someone who lives in New England, I can assure you witch trials was always my least favorite part of semi-local history. However, when we think of witch trials in America, we think of a very specific aesthetic, a very specific interpretation. In contrast, the witch trials of Europe varied depending on the century, the location, and the severity. Some ended in mass executions, others did not. Some were all women, others were not. Some were all men, others were not. The witch trials went on for centuries, and it is impossible to bury them down to just a simple aesthetic. However, the viewpoints of society during the periods of the witch trials is the critical importance that connects the witch trials to literature, not simply the aesthetic of women being burned at the stake or drowned because they practice alternative medicine, which, for the record, in the 1600s was pretty much the only medicine that existed. So, just leave that out there, guys. Just saying. Anywho, innately connected to Eve through the cultural perspectives that women were weak and corruptible, and Lucifer because of the common association between witchcraft and the devil, the witch trials brought about thousands of deaths and permanently changed the cultural view of evil. No longer reserved for eldritch monsters, evil could now be found in neighbors and other community members, and the only salvation was through religion. This view on evil remained until Enlightenment philosophies began to shift the societal norms of Europe and eventually led to the 19th and 20th century change in the definition of evil. However, the view that evil could be hidden within a beautiful woman or a handsome man remains prevalent. Evil was no longer reserved for gruesome demonic beasts. It could now be shown in handsome men who drank women's blood, or beautiful mothers who secretly sacrificed farm animals to perform magical spells. This perception that evil was no longer centered purely on the physical, but on the internal, the mental, and the philosophical, is something that is profoundly impactful on the evil of modern fantasy literature. Evil is very rarely in the shape of monsters, aside from some men with wings and some men who can turn into dragons. The concept that evil could come from within, and even a beautiful person could be evil, became more prevalent in this period. The Brothers Grimm's Snow White, while based off of older stories, became a very popular example of this. The evil queen was vain and desperate for beauty, and yet still her heart was cold. Beauty was no longer associated with purity, as it had been in the days of Beowulf and Arthurian legend. Beauty had become more complex, just as the idea of evil was becoming more complex. Evil remains as prevalent in modern literature and pop culture as it was 1,000 years ago. It is hard to give a clear definition of modern literature. Can you interrupt me at doing my... However, for the sake of simplicity, anything after 1900 is considered modern. Evil is everywhere, from the popularity of Marvel movies centered on heroes and villains to the complex morality of political dramas like Shonda Rhimes' Scandal. However, no medium or genre is as entrenched in the debate over evil as fantasy and science fiction novels. Transforming over the decades, the modern fantasy genre began in the mid-20th century, with the literature-defining works of writer and professor J.R. Tolkien. A lover of classical fairy tales and epics, Tolkien's works include many elements of the stories from the past. He even wrote his own translation of Beowulf. However, it is the portrayal of evil in Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings series and the many appendices and notes of this world that followed that defined the fantasy genre's love affair with evil for decades to come. A devout Christian, Tolkien's works held a great deal of religious influence, but his interpretations of evil didn't end at purely good and purely bad. I'm not gonna cut this. You guys get to enjoy my cat being a chaotic agent of chaos. The mastery of Tolkien's depictions of evil rest in the many historical and literary influences he took into account while writing. By combining centuries of philosophy and literature relating to evil, Tolkien allowed his books to show the multifaceted nature of the concept of evil, while also providing future writers and scholars an endless source of debate with his nuanced depictions of evil. Tolkien's works remain the most influential of the century until the late 90s, when another genre-defying series, J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter, would enter the fray and usher in an era of morally complex literature unlike any seen before. And it is here that I must bring up a digression of sorts, an interlude, if you will, into the brief but impactful world of fanfiction. To be as quick as possible, the popularity of Harry Potter fanfiction and its influence on the modern influx of morally ambiguous characters in the modern literary market is impossible to deny. Aside from the instances of Harry Potter, Star Wars, and Twilight fanfiction that have now been published as actual novels that inspire other novels of similar styles with similar depictions of character archetypes and love interests, fanfiction as a whole has always been a medium to explore taboo or less mainstream topics. As such, it is no surprise that a dominant force within fanfiction across all genres, but specifically fantasy, is moral ambiguity and the complexity of evil. Fanfiction, without a doubt, influenced the modern rise of moral ambiguity as much as the source material it was based on. Which brings us into the final era, the modern day, the dominance of YA fantasy and fantasy literature as a whole. People remain divided on whether literary views of evil can be equated to social norms relating to them, and the modern boon in morally ambiguous literary characters doesn't help matters. No matter how you look at it, the dawn of the 21st century brought forth a new age of popular literature. The popularity of Stephanie Meyer's Twilight series, Suzanne Collins' Hunger Games series, and Cassandra Clare's The Moral Instrument series all focused on moral ambiguity and explorations of evil and morality. Children of the early 21st century were raised in a world where evil is no longer as simple as the hero killing the villain. The heroes of best-selling series, such as Sarah J. Maas's Throne of Glass and Alex Astor's Lightlark, kill people, both good and bad, for their own selfish reasons, not simply for the safety of others, or even for glory, or any righteous chivalry, as was back in the day with Arthurian legend. The beloved main characters of books such as Leigh Bardugo's Six of Crows duology, aka a gang of criminals whose actions would be considered evil by many centuries ago, is proof enough. Morally gray heroes are no longer reserved for risque novels like The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, a key example in the history of moral ambiguity. Dorian Gray, while often romanticized and aestheticized, is an example of a morally ambiguous character. Wilde uses him to explore a variety of themes, including morality, death, and immortality, in a time when those ideas were at the forefront of everyone's minds. However, it was frowned upon. It wasn't popular. It wasn't cool to say Dorian Gray was your favorite character in the way it is to say Kaz Brekker is your favorite character, or the way it is to say that Jon Snow is your favorite character, or Daenerys Targaryen your favorite character. Morally gray heroes are no longer reserved for risque novels, but found within most popular fiction. George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones centers on protagonists and antagonists who shift sides constantly, and yet there are fans for all of them, no matter the atrocities they commit. There might even be a couple fans of Joffrey out there somewhere. Even if we can all agree he and Ramsay Bolton are the purest of pure evil, up there with the likes of Dolores Umbridge. Either way, the truth of the matter is, modern literature is full of complexity. Moral ambiguity is a favorite of modern authors. Using Leigh Bardugo again, her series Ninth House is filled with moral ambiguity. One of her main characters, Darlington, at the beginning seems to be somewhat of a Byronic hero, a bit of a twist on the tall, dark, and brooding man, but still familiar enough for the audience who is interested in such characters to relate to him. However, as we go through the story, we realize that his morality, his strive to be the perfect textbook, blue-blooded Yale student, is a cover for traumas and darkness in his past. He has desires, he has temptations, And most of all, he has morally reprehensible actions. He commits a few minor crimes. I mean, so, technically there is no property damage not to his own property. But yeah, there's that. Darlington, like most of Lee's characters, is not a right or wrong. He's complex, he's creative. It's safe to say that the only one of Leigh Bardugo's characters who you could really claim has never done anything morally apprehensible is David Caustic. And even then, under coercion and or blind faith, he put a magical amplifier on Alina Starkov against her will by orders of his boss, the Darkling. Even the most innocent and purely good characters within any of Leigh Bardugo's writing are still morally ambiguous. This doesn't just signal a shift in the dark-haired brooding love interest, or the dark-haired versus blonde enemy in a love triangle, like Grimshaw in Alex Astor's Lightlark series, who, among other things, went to war for a main character and was willing to destroy an entire island for her. We've come a long way. I feel like if Tolkien knew that the classic male archetype in modern popular fantasy went to war for their wives and was completely willing to destroy innocents with no cause, I feel like Tolkien might have had a heart attack. Then again, the Rings of Power exists and includes elements of moral ambiguity I'm not sure Tolkien would have rubber stamped, but that's a different video. In conclusion, before I digress so far, I miss my next class. When looking at modern literature, the definition of evil is more complex than simply the opposite of good. The discussion is far more nuanced in the 21st century than it was in the 9th. The prevalence of moral ambiguity in popular literature signals a shift in cultural beliefs around evil and shows the drastic differences between the concept of evil depicted within early fantasy literature and the modern view of evil within modern fantasy literature. In other words, it's a long, complex road, and we have evolved from the simplicity of Beowulf, but elements of primordial good versus primordial evil, elements of evil hidden within a beautiful shell, and elements of evil within plain sight are all still prominent. Just because the dark-haired, morally ambiguous love interest may be synonymous with modern romantasy doesn't mean that this is the only variant of moral ambiguity in popular fiction. Overall, the concept of evil has shifted and allowed for more creative and interesting stories to be told. Leigh Bardugo's books, again, are a great example. Her characters are complex characters with complex moral dilemmas and complex views of evil actions. A good character killing another perceived good character a few centuries ago would have been heresy. But in the modern day, a good character killing another perceived good character could be a means to an end. It could be a way to save the world. It would be viewed as an interesting character struggle. And this development of evil within fantasy literature and supernatural stories shows us how, with time, most concepts will evolve. Simplistic stories do not capture readers' attention. Complex ones do. And one of the most complex things to talk about in your story is the complex idea of evil. Woo! That was a lot of information I threw at you there. I'm not even sure my conclusion made sense. I was ad-libbing there at the end, even though my script was like massive. I apologize for what was probably a very long-winded ramble about literature. I put a lot of work into this one, a lot of research. So I hope y'all enjoyed today's video. If you'd like to see more videos like this, any follow-up essays, possibly a longer, more complex video essay on more examples of evil and supernatural stories. Again, like I didn't even have time to get into Frankenstein or Picture of Dorian Gray, or things like that. Please subscribe to this channel and comment what section you found the most interesting, what century or literary example of evil you found the most enticing, and like this video for more like it. But that's all for today. Bye, my lovely writers. I hope you have a delightful rest of your day, and this video helped you on your writing journey.